after this should be live. So
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm Mary Jones. I serve as chair of the Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee for the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask the members of the advisory committee to respond to a roll call to their presence at this open meeting that's being conducted remotely by conference call and other electronic medium. Jim Kilmartin, Janine Coleman.
Here.
Nicole Eitzen.
Here.
Don Fleeker.
Here.
Jim Godby.
Here.
Chris Haben.
Here.
And Marcy Lechtenberg.
Here.
I note that the following BSRB staff members are also present. David Fye.
here.
And next, David will read a message to us concerning this meeting being held remotely.
Thank you, Mary. This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to provide public comment or answer questions from individuals. Individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting as no individuals requested to provide public comment. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is conducted by a medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of KOMA are not suspended, so we'll be conducting this meeting pursuant to KOMA. On March 21st, 2022 or 2023, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of the advisory committee meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other meeting material have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. And you may also request a copy of the agenda by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov directly with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call and the YouTube channel that allows members of the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And the conference call line is active. I did check that before the meeting, and there are no individuals on the conference call line.
Okay, thank you, David. Committee members, the next item of business is the agenda approval. So we've received the agenda in your packet. Are there any discussion items or any changes to that? If not, I'll take a motion to approve the agenda.
I move to approve.
Thank you, Marcy. Is there a second?
Second.
Everyone in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Great. If you would turn your attention to the minutes from our December 9th meeting that were also included in your packet. Please take a minute to review those. And when ready, we'll take a motion to approve if there aren't any changes.
I move the approval.
Thank you, Jim. Is there a second?
I
Second.
second.
Nicole, thank you for that. All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed, same sign. Okay, David, we'll hand it back over to you for your director's report.
Thank you, Mary. So I'll start off with some updates concerning BSRB operations, and then we can go to some legislative updates as well. Concerning BSRB operations, one item that I had informed the board about earlier this year, they had there was some federal dollars that were available through a SPARK committee for individual agencies that were doing modernization projects and equipment modernization. And so we had applied for a couple of small, essentially grants to use some of the federal dollars to make upgrades here at the board office. One was to replace, to actually purchase a camera to better enable us to do hybrid meetings. And then one was to replace a projector in the boardroom that would help out with some of those hybrid meetings as well. And we were approved for that funding. That funding has been transferred now to the BSRB in a special federal fund. And we've been working with the Office of Information Technology Services to purchase those items, and they should be delivered in the near future. and then we'll be able to essentially complete that process. But I've been in the process of making sure that we're providing timely reports in terms of those federal dollars and then the progress towards that. So was able to save a little bit of money through that, and we'll have some better technology in the future so we can do more hybrid meetings or have more accessibility here at the board office. In terms of some legislative updates, so I wanted to update you on a couple of different items. First, so every year, all agencies have to have their budget approved by the legislature. And even though the BSRB does not receive any money directly from the state, the legislature does set a limit to how much the agency is able to spend each year. So even if we had additional funding in our fee fund, we would be limited by what the legislature puts in an appropriations bill every year. And so this year we came before the legislature with some revised estimates. There were some increases in cost, and that was largely trying to project increased cost for the future, somewhat related to, we are a small agency and we contract with other entities to receive certain services. And we believe that those are going to be going up over the next few years. And so we had submitted a budget to the legislature, and the governor is who we submitted it to first back in September of last year. The governor recommended our budget for this year at the amount that was approved by last year's legislature. And then the governor recommended the same amounts that we had requested for the next 2 fiscal years. And so the House and the Senate considered the agency's budget separately in 2 different committees. The Senate approved the amount that was in the governor's recommendation with no changes. The House in the House Health Higher Education Budget Committee added some proviso language. And when this proviso language was essentially attached to the bill, what it would have the effect of doing is when you have proviso language added, it either says the agency cannot spend money on something, or it must do something by spending money for that purpose. And so the language that was added by the House was to prohibit the BSRB from adopting or imposing as a condition of obtaining or renewing licenses or permits any incentives or requirements that applicants for licensure or permit undergo, demonstrate familiarity with, or support any training, education, or instruction program that includes diversity, equity, inclusion, anti-racism, critical race theory, or other related topics. And it was noted that this language did not apply to equal opportunity prohibition on discrimination based on protected class status or under state and federal law. And so when that language was attached by the House Budget Committee, they went ahead and included that for fiscal years 2024 and 2025. And then when the budget was reported out by the chair of that budget committee to the House Appropriations Committee, they had discussion on whether that should stay on the agency's budget for those 2 fiscal years or not. And they did go ahead ultimately and decide that that should stay in their House position on the agency's budget. And so ultimately the House passed the appropriations bill, the Senate passed a separate appropriations bill. And then I believe it was last week, right before they left, maybe it was the week before, the House and the Senate conferenced on items of difference between their budget bills. And this was one of those items of difference. And ultimately they decided to go with the House version. So before they left for their traditional break, which they're on right now, they passed a consensus budget bill. And in that bill, it did include this language for the BSRB's budget. So the practical effect of that is that at least for the next 2 years, I think the BSRB would be essentially prohibited from implementing a requirement that would require this type of education or training as a requirement for licensure or for someone to have a permit. And you may be wondering where this came from. So the BSRB does not currently require education or training like this as a requirement for licensure. There is a bill that the board had requested introduction of that included several different items, and I'll talk about that here in a little bit. But one of the items in that bill would have made a change to the continuing education requirements for all professions. And one of the changes in that bill would have said that after January 1st of 2025, individuals who are able to diagnose and treat at the clinical level, they would be required to have 3 hours in ethics, which they currently are required to do. And then it would decrease the 6 hours in diagnosis and treatment down to 3 hours. And then for all levels of licensure, there would be a new continuing education requirement for 3 hours in cultural diversity training. And the language for that was included in the bill was modeled after what licensed psychologists are currently required to receive in Texas. They're actually currently required to get 6 hours in that. And so the board did not want to limit the flexibility of practitioners to be able to use the additional continuing education hours in other areas. but essentially right now 9 hours between the 3 hours of ethics and 6 in diagnosis and treatment are in specific categories. And so with that language in the bill, it would have essentially had 9 hours in 3 different categories. But the reason this is a little unusual in the agency's budget is because this was not an action towards the bill. It was an action towards the agency's budget. So I think the language was added in the event that that would have passed into law. Essentially, this language on the budget would have basically meant that we couldn't spend any dollars to make that a requirement. And from a practical standpoint, staff time really computes to dollars. And so it would have basically prohibited the agency from implementing something like that. So that is on the agency's budget. I think it'll make it very challenging if the board did want to revisit that in the next couple of years in terms of adding any kind of requirements in that area. But I wanted to make you all aware of that because that was essentially the final position on the agency's budget, and the budget bill has now been passed. It is to the governor's office. The governor is reviewing that right now, and sometimes the governor makes line item vetoes, but I'm not sure what actions the governor might take. But essentially, the governor is expected to take action on the budget bill. And then when the legislature comes back in a couple weeks, then they'll be able to revisit any action the governor took on that bill. Also, when the legislature comes back, that'll be for a time period generally referred to as omnibus. And at omnibus, they basically wrap up any items that are still out there, and they get updated revenue estimates, updated estimates on things like human service consensus caseload expenditures. And then they have any remaining items that could be in a governor's budget amendment or things like that. So those items will be looked at here in a couple weeks. But in terms of the agency's budget, it is likely for the most part done for the year. Although generally when they come back for omnibus, they can do a supplementary budget bill, which could have any additional cleanup items. So in terms of the budget, that is where the agency's budget currently stands. We have been approved for the expenditures the governor recommended. So in terms of the amount we can spend, that has been resolved. But that proviso will carry on the agency's budget likely for the next couple of years. Are there any questions about that before I go into a couple other legislative items?
Yes. Just for my own clarification. So if you were to raise more money than you spend, because you have a spending limit, what happens to those dollars?
They stay in the fund. So we essentially are required as a fee-funded agency that 10% of all revenue goes to the state general fund. And so that would have to go to the state regardless of how much we raise, up to a cap of $100,000. And then anything else that we would receive, it would stay in the fund. And so essentially what the legislature does is they set a limit, and then we can't spend above that limit. And then once we have that limit spent, then what we do from our perspective is we try to look for any way that we can have savings that's not going to hurt the agency. And so if we don't have to spend the money, we don't spend it. And then that money doesn't go anywhere at the end of the year, it just stays in the fund. And so it's to the benefit of licensees if we can have savings, because that way it's a longer period of time before we would have to revisit anything like fee increases or things like that.
Okay. My second question is, I just want to make sure I understood what you said correctly regarding the budget. So the House side, the proviso that is on there effectively prevents you from changing the 6 credits of DSM to 3 DSM and 3 with the diversity training.
That is so
Practically speaking, that's the impact of that.
The proviso, I would limit it just to the diversity training requirement, because the statutes really control, like in the statutes, it says right now there's 3 hours of ethics and 6 hours in diagnosis and treatment. And so the change in front of the legislature was in a bill to modify that statute. And so the proposal to require 3 hours in cultural diversity training, that was not approved when the bill was worked through committee. And so that piece of it basically would continue on to the agency's budget, so that we'd be limited from requiring that as a continuing education requirement or as a general requirement for licensure.
So you had said that proviso was done as a budget factor and not a factor of the bill. I'm hard pressed to understand that.
Yeah, it's
to be honest with you. And if I'm asking inappropriate, I apologize. I just don't. that sounds far more political than just that's a budget thing. I'm disappointed to hear that, to be honest with you.
It's not completely unusual, but it's rare that it happens. And sometimes specific language is added to make sure that an agency does something. And sometimes language is added to basically prohibit an agency from spending any dollars on a certain thing.
Wow.
And so it is unusual. And they did talk about the same points that you made in the budget committee and also in the appropriations committee. But their ultimate decision at the end of that process was to go ahead and include it.
Wow.
And I think, Chris, as he speaks about the actual bills and the modifications in the next section, I think you'll kind of hear what happened in terms of the bills we were putting forth. There's a lot of changes in the bill that we proposed.
Yeah. I just want to make sure I'm tracking and understanding. I'm
Yes.
slow to foot sometimes.
No, great. It's good to ask these questions. Absolutely.
Well, and generally, I wouldn't spend this much time talking about the agency's budget as a fee-funded agency. You know, we never really asked the state to give us more money. They don't really give us any money. We
Right.
collect money from licensees, and then we try to be good stewards of those dollars. And if we don't have to spend money, we don't. But at the same time, you know, given how small of an agency we are, we contract with this entity for our licensing and this entity for legal services, and then we get additional services here and there. Some of those, we just get a notification that they're passing on costs to us from some of the people that they work with. And then, you know, we never want to be in a position to where we wouldn't be able to essentially, you know, pay staff, or if we had something come up and we couldn't, you know, receive those legal services because the extent of our funding had, you know, we reached our cap. So we always try to estimate with what we believe we would need. And then once we have that limit set, then we do our part to make sure we don't spend the money in case we need to. But it's a good question you asked as far as if we don't spend it, what happens? Because for the state general fund dollars, for some of those agencies that receive money from the state, sometimes when they don't spend it, it just goes away, it goes back to the state. But for the BSRB fee fund, essentially, if we don't spend those dollars, it just stays in the fund. And so the more money that we can keep as a healthy balance in the fund, the better. We don't want it to grow. And in fact, the board made some fee decreases recently, back in about 2019, to slowly draw the balance down. And so that's something that we're working with too, to make sure that it doesn't go down too quickly. And so it's about finding that balance. So, but I'll go ahead and move to the items in the bill, because I think that's the second part of this that'll help make more sense of some of these items. So the board and all of you as advisory committee members worked really hard last year, and I appreciated all the time that you spent and all the work. There were a lot of good recommendations that ultimately went into the bill that was requested by the board. It was actually a 65-page bill, and that was fairly lengthy, but part of that was because, you know, as a composite board, the board oversees 7 different professions, and they each have a different set of statutes. And so some of those changes were the same changes, but 6 or 7 times. But the bill had a lot of really good items. Some of the items, just as a reminder of what's included in the bill, the board had a really good discussion about reciprocity requirements. And currently right now, for a lot of individuals who apply for reciprocity, the language states they would have to practice in their jurisdiction for 48 of the past 54 months. And the ultimate consensus of the board to put into the bill would be to reduce that time period down to 12 months. And that 12-month time period is consistent with a change that was put into law a couple years ago for certain applicants that were military members, military spouses, and those individuals that reside in Kansas or intend to reside in Kansas. And so I think the board was looking at that and saying, you know, can we be helpful, still making sure that we're enforcing appropriate standards? And so that was one of the changes, and that still is an item in the bill. The bill that was requested by the BSRB is House Bill 2340. Another item that was included in that was there was some language added to the bill that would allow some flexibility for current licensees. If they had an extreme situation that prevented them from completing their continuing education hours, they could apply to the board for additional time to complete those hours while still being able to renew their license. And if they were approved, they would get that additional time, but it would help more people stay licensed as a workforce effort. And there was also some language to provide incentives for individuals to rejoin the workforce. If individuals had previously been licensed and their licenses had expired, if those individuals had been out of the workforce or out of the BSRB for at least a year, the cost to come back would have been reduced in half. And also it would create a new type of a 6-month temporary reinstatement license, which would allow individuals to be able to work under that temporary reinstatement license while attaining the necessary continuing education to have their license permanently reinstated. And so that was looked at as a helpful way to help bring people back to the professions if they stepped away because of their health, someone else's health, professional burnout, or other reasons. We want to create a way to regrow the workforce from having previous licensees come back. There was also a recommendation still in the bill, which would increase the time for certain temporary licenses. For certain individuals, when they apply for licensure and we reviewed their education and they still need to pass the licensing examination, some of those individuals can apply for a temporary license to be able to work while they're taking that licensing examination. And for some of the individuals right now, for the professions, it's limited to 1 year, but other professions have that as a 2-year temporary license. And so the bill would essentially make that a 2-year period of time for temporary license holders, which we've heard some people have trouble passing the licensure examinations. And so this would allow them more time. If they didn't pass it on their first attempt, they would be able to take it again while still being able to work, but also provide more security for employers who want to provide employment for these individuals on temporary licenses. So that's still in the bill. Additionally, we've had a situation come up with the social work profession where we have new programs that are being started and they are seeking to become accredited by their accrediting body, but that process can take 3 to 3.5 years. And so we have individuals who are coming through these new programs. Often these are new online programs, and the program is seeking that accreditation, but it will still take a little bit of time. And so the question is, how can the board treat these people fairly that have graduated from these programs that are seeking accreditation, but the process has not completed yet. And so in Minnesota, they have a model where they can grant a temporary license to those individuals who graduate from those programs, and then they're able to work. And then once their programs reach full accreditation, then those individuals with the temporary licenses would be able to get permanent licenses. And so that language is included in the bill. Actually, that language is also included in a separate bill, 2375, which is also in front of the legislature this year. That bill has slightly different language, and it includes some additional information about online schools as well. There was also an item in the bill that would create a new type of student addiction counselor license that would be for individuals who are seeking to become addiction counselors, but they still have coursework that is needed to be completed. And the board designed a process that they would put into this bill, which would allow those individuals to be able to work under a structured environment, have an agreement with their school, and also for that employer to be able to employ them as student addiction counselor temporary license holders. And then they would have a limited amount of time to complete their coursework. And then once they had completed the requirements and passed the licensing examination, then they could become addiction counselors. There were also some cleanup items in the bill for the licensed psychology profession and for the behavior analyst profession to make some of their standards for disciplinary remedies and also licensure requirements more consistent with some of the standards for the other professions. And we did also take a look at the statutes, and we tried to just make general cleanup items. Some of the definition sections needed to be reworked. And so we put a lot of work into that bill, and a lot of effort went into it to make it a good product. And the bill went before the House Health and Human Services Committee. And when that bill went in front of the committee made 6 amendments, and 3 items were removed from the bill, and then 3 items were added. One of the items that was removed that I referenced earlier was that board recommendation to decrease the number of continuing education hours in diagnosis and treatment from 6 to 3, and then to add a new 3-hour requirement in cultural diversity continuing education training. The House committee removed the cultural diversity training requirement and decided that they wanted to essentially reduce the number of hours in diagnosis and treatment from 6 down to 3. So they wanted to change that from the 6 to 3, but not add a new requirement for something else for those 3 hours, just to decrease it from 6 to 3. Another item they also wanted to remove from the bill was for the social work profession. There was some language that would have required board-approved supervisors for the social work profession, and they wanted to remove that, so they did remove that from the bill. And then also back in about 2014, the behavior analyst profession was added, and Since that time, that profession has grown, but there is not a board member listed in statute for that profession. And so the 12 members of the board are identified in statute as being 8 professional members from different professions and then 4 public members. And there's not language right now for the behavior analyst profession. And so the board was supportive and recommended adding language to that bill to add a 13th board member for the behavior analyst profession. And the House went ahead and removed that as an item from the bill. And then the 3 changes of additional new language that the committee added to the bill. One of those items was for the social work profession. That item essentially significantly reduced the required coursework in statute for individuals to become clinical social workers. Right now, the clinical level of social worker is able to diagnose and treat independently. And one of the requirements in the statute was to obtain 15 hours and basically topics related to being able to diagnose and treat. And the House committee decreased that from the 15 hours and the specific topics that were identified down to 3 hours and removed a number of those named topics. Additionally, individuals seeking to become a clinical social worker have to complete a practicum and then also have to do the 3,000 hours of postgraduate supervised experience. Included within that 100 hours, they have to have, or included within that 3,000 hours, they have to have 1,500 hours of direct client contact, actually diagnosing and treating individuals. And what the House did is added language that essentially said the 1,500 hours would include, but be not limited to, doing diagnosing and treating. And so from our perspective as having to enforce that as a possible standard, it appears that what that would do is it would take it from a standard of having to have 1,500 hours doing those things down to a standard of perhaps only 1 hour, because as long as it's included, but it's not limited to that, then as long as it's included within that 1,500 hours, it appears that it would meet that as a qualification. And then the remaining hours are not defined within that 1,500. So we had significant concerns about that, which were later raised to the Senate committee when that bill was moved to the Senate. These were all amendments that were made at the very end of the process. We didn't have the opportunity to talk to the committee about these changes. The way it works is you have a hearing where individuals are able to talk to the bill. And then when they work the bill, that's a process that's just the committee members and we can sit and observe. But when they do the amendments, we're not able to come to the podium to, correct any information or add any comments. And so that was the first one for the clinical social work profession. Second one was an item for the BSRB in terms of our operations. One of the items they wanted to add in would be to say, it would add new language to statute that would say within the first 15 days that the BSRB receives an application, we would need to have sent a message back to the individual who applied, letting them know if we have a complete application or an incomplete application. And if it's incomplete, what else is left remaining for us to have a complete application for them. So just to let you know, there's a number of other regulatory boards in the state of Kansas, and I've talked to a number of contacts outside the state of Kansas. To my understanding, this type of a 15-day standard and this type of a review put in law would be unique. And I don't know of any other agencies in the state of Kansas or any in other states that would have that kind of requirement. And as I mentioned before, we have a small agency, we have 10 of us total. And so right now we ask individuals to allow between 30 to 45 days after we have a complete application. So for us to do that type of expedited automatic 15-day review and evaluation, we don't have the staffing for that. And the bill would also say that once we have a complete application, we would be required to issue a decision within 30 days. And one of the concerns about that is, while it sounds like it would be helpful for some individuals, it is not to the advantage of all people. For example, if someone were to apply for licensure now, let's say they were a social worker or they want to become a social worker and they applied, but their program is in that candidacy stage and it would not meet the other requirements and regulation. Essentially right now, what we can do is we can say, based on the current standards, we could either process your application and deny your license because you don't currently meet the requirements. But if this bill goes into effect and it's enacted, I believe you would likely meet the requirements for licensure. And so what we can do right now is we can offer that if they're okay with that, we can hold it. And then pending the passage of the bill, we would be able to apply the new standard to their benefit. But that language in statute that would require us to do those within 30 days provides no flexibility. And so that was a big concern. There was also some language that would say the BSRB would need to develop an expedited licensure review process where individuals would pay an extra fee. And then if they made a request for an expedited review within 15 days, we would have to issue a decision. The problem is that statute does not make any reference to us having a complete file. And if we don't have a complete file that shows that they meet the qualifications, we can't give them a license. And so our concern on that is that you could have individuals who essentially are paying an extra fee for a fast decision, and that fast decision is going to be a denial. And we don't just send a letter to someone that says, you applied, you're denied for licensure. A denial is an actual, real significant process. And so that's why we bring matters that could be denied in front of the full board for them to review the facts and make that decision. And essentially what would happen in some of these cases is if the board was not scheduled to meet under that time period, we would have to, do a denial without the full board being able to review that. Or potentially, we also have to have a legal order that summarizes the decision anytime we have a denial, which explains the facts, the analysis, and then the specific legal remedies for that person to request a hearing. And so those cannot be just turned around in a day. Those do take time, and some of that time is outside of our control. And so I think there were some good intentions behind some of these things, but from a practical standpoint, working through the logistics, it would create a lot of problems. And so we have put together some proposed changes, and there's one more change I'll talk about before we kind of talk about the next step in this process. But the last change the House made was so they also wanted to create something that is called a community-based license. And so one of the associations that testified on the original bill in front of the House committee was requesting the creation of something called a community-based license. And what essentially this would be is it would function more or less like a temporary license. It would be limited to no more than 24 months. You wouldn't be able to get it more than once if you had already had one of these before. The original language in the bill, when it was added through that amendment, was that it would be under the employment authority of a community mental health center, and you would have to be under the clinical supervision, at the end of the supervision of someone with a clinical level license. But the concerning part of these new community-based licenses is that these would be for the licensed psychology profession, for the marriage and family therapy profession, for the professional counseling profession, and also for the bachelor's and master's level social work of the social work profession. And essentially what would happen is these would be individuals who had not passed the licensure examination, but they were attempting to pass that test. These would not be individuals with a permanent license, but based on the language that was added through that amendment, they would be able to use the title and also the initials of a permanent license holder. So for example, for the licensed psychology profession, individuals who had a community-based license would have not passed the licensing examination, would have a temporary license, but currently right now, those people would have to say that their license was temporary and they wouldn't be able to just use the initials LP. But under this, they would be able to do that as long as they worked for a CMHC. And they were under the other requirements based on this new language. For the marriage and family therapy profession, it would not involve the clinical level, but it would say that if you were someone who was under this new community-based license, you would be able to use the initials LMFT, and you would be able to call yourself a licensed marriage and family therapist, even though you did not have a permanent license and you had not passed the licensing examination. And I heard behind the scenes that one of the reasons why this was being requested is that some of the individuals who work at certain facilities who are working under a temporary license were having difficulty with certain reimbursements. And I think, unfortunately, instead of that issue being resolved by the individuals that handle the reimbursements, or perhaps the legislature working on that with the different parties involved, this was looked at as a possible solution to just allow these individuals who didn't have a permanent license to be able to use those titles as a way to get perhaps more reimbursements. From a public protection standpoint, it draws a lot of red flags to us because we want individuals from the public to be very clear if they're getting services from someone who has met all the qualifications for a permanent license. And we think the public has a right to know if someone providing services to them really is a permanent license holder or if someone has a temporary license. And with this, it would be a lack of clarity and a concern from a public protection standpoint. For some of you who are, all of you are licensees, I would also think that it would be troubling for you too, because the concern is not only that there would be these people who would be putting forward that they are a permanent license holder, or at least using that terminology that has previously been meant to mean that. I think it would call into question anyone who is a permanent license holder who uses those credentials, because if this muddies the water and then individuals are out there and they know that someone is providing services to them who has an LMFT credential, they might say, well, do you really have a permanent credential, or are you one of these special people that's able to use that credential even though you're not a permanent licensee? And I think that's one of the troubling things about these things. When the bill moved to the Senate, it was heard in the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee. And when these amendments were put on the bill, board had a chance to review those at a board meeting, and we had discussions about some of the concerns. And when the bill was heard by the Senate committee, I met with the different members of that Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee. I scheduled meetings with every single member because based on the amount of time, I realized we would not have a lot of time actually at that meeting. And so I scheduled meetings with all of them, some of them both before and after the hearing. And in my testimony, I included specific language and requested amendments to address some of these concerns. And I thought, based on those conversations behind the scenes, that members of the committee were receptive and they understood the issues and the problems. Additionally, after that House meeting where these amendments were added, I called individuals who I believe were advocates for these positions, and I had conversations with them behind the scenes, expressing the concerns of the board, trying to find out if there was ways that we could reach perhaps compromise language or something that might address some of their concerns without creating quite the impact or the problems of these amendments. And I thought some of that language and some of those conversations were well received. And we used those as the basis for some of the amendments that we requested to the bill in the Senate committee. But then when it was time for the amendments to be offered in the Senate, none of the members of the committee offered those amendments that we had requested. And one of the members of the committee was well aware of the problems and concerns and expected there to be amendments that were offered. And so when they were not, he made a motion in that committee to table the bill because he said this would allow the agency more time to work with people to address some of these concerns. But ultimately, the members of that Senate committee did not vote in favor of tabling the bill. And so it did move forward with one additional amendment. It was a very odd amendment that basically said, if you previously held a licensed a temporary addiction counselor student license, that you wouldn't be able to get a community-based license later, which was not something that we had requested. It was not something that I was even aware of until that was offered in the committee. But they asked me in the committee if that addressed the concerns of the board. And, like I said, we're not able to discuss. And so I shook my head in the back of the room, and they verbally noted that the board it does not appear this addresses the concerns of the board, which of course it did not. But they went ahead and made that as an amendment to have an item of difference. And then ultimately it passed out of committee. It did not get passed on the Senate floor. So in terms of the BSRB bill, House Bill 2340 is not going forward this year. However, because of the legislative process, if a bill passes one chamber, it is eligible to be included in a conference committee. And so sometimes when there are items of difference between certain bills, the House and the Senate form 3-member conference committees, 3 members of the House, 3 members of the Senate, and they come together and they discuss the bill in question. And then sometimes they add other bills within those conference committee shells. That's what they refer to them as. And so currently right now, a modified version of that has been included in Senate Bill 131. And I only know this because last week they had a lot of real quick, fast and furious meetings. Some of them went as late as 4:30 in the morning. And so they left before actually voting on that conference committee report. But the items for the BSRB bill are included in Senate Bill 131, and that is a conference committee report that's eligible for them to work when they come back in a couple weeks. And so I want to make you aware of sort of all of those moving pieces. I'm very concerned about the language in that. I'm also concerned about, going forward and having several conversations with members of the legislature about all these different items and that not amounting to the changes that were necessary. And I even talked to multiple people and I said, look, the board is very receptive to having conversations on all these items. If you look at our bill, this is why I went through all the different items that are currently included in the bill. It's not that the board is unwilling to change. The board very much came to the table. And last year, the legislature asked the board to come to the table to bring forward ways to address workforce and other issues. And the board really did that. And we have a bill that takes a measured and thoughtful approach to making real good concrete changes. And unfortunately, some of those items are kind of being lost in the shuffle because of these problematic things that were included. And so one of the things that I have done since then, when they come back for this omnibus period, they do have a omnibus memo that they review. And if there's any bills that have been passed, they will ask agencies, do you need additional expenditure authority based on something that has happened, or do you need any new positions based on that? They would still need to take an action to actually approve that. But one thing that I have done, even though this bill is not passed yet, I've asked for the BSRB contents to be included, and I've asked for them to at least authorize, if this bill does pass, to at least authorize expenditure authority to bring on 2 new licensing staff members. This would need to be an additional expenditure authority, additional staffing. We still have logistical concerns in terms of where to put these individuals. And so, but I think without at least having that part of it, I think it would be a real problem in terms of us even being close to meeting the requirements in law for this. And so I've asked for them to be made aware of the issues, and then also for them to be made aware that that is something at a minimum that we would need, but also to add a note that we would want to reevaluate this going forward as well, because it's very likely we would need to come and ask for more funding, either for more legal expenses or additional staffing. And just from a practical perspective too, the BSRB office, we don't have a lot of extra room. In fact, we don't have any extra room. We don't have any physical space to add staff members without really trying to think outside the box and do something really drastic and creative. And so, so these are really problematic things with the bill right now, but I wanted to kind of walk through that and walk through it in a sort of a timeline approach, just so you would understand where we're at right now. If the bill ultimately does pass, we will send something out to all licensees to make them aware of the different items in the bill. But I wanted to give you the opportunity to ask any questions and make sure that you were all informed about this information too.
I know that was a significant amount of information, and Dave's been very mindful of keeping the board fully engaged and updated as the bill moves forward, and certainly notes in truth there were some real surprises and things we didn't anticipate. But when you open, you propose a bill, you sort of open that door up for other advocacy groups to step in and work with legislators to come up with suggested changes. But I definitely want to provide some time for comments or questions because it was a lot of information.
Okay. Okay, so first of all, so the community-based license is effectively the same. The criteria to gain that would be what, and in effect, like an R World and LMFT would be minus having passed the national exam.
So
Temporary maybe is a better way to look at it.
Sorry, yeah.
right, it's more of a temporary license holder. And I forgot to mention, there was one adjustment they made when it got to conference committee. They did originally include it just for the CMHC, so you'd have to be under the employment of the community mental health center. The new language they added on that point in the conference committee was to also include individuals who are under the scope of employment at a federally qualified health center, the FQHCs, individuals under the scope of employment at psychiatric residential treatment facilities, so PRTFs, and then other private facilities as defined in KSA 59-29B46, which I believe is some of the inpatient drug and alcohol facilities. And so so that was the additional change. And they did also, I saw that they added language that basically said if you had a community-based license, you could not later have a temporary license for the same license level. So essentially, you could not get a community-based license and then later a temporary license. It would be one or the other. And so the temporary license holders, one of the main differences is they have to note that they have a temporary license, whereas these individuals with a community-based license, the way that it's currently worded, would be able to use essentially LMFT without any kind of designation that it's a temporary license. So
Yeah, so it's not community, it's not it is LMFT. It's just, wow.
And, in truth, this really looks to be an insurance reimbursement issue. If, for those who are familiar, the temporary licenses cannot get all of the full insurance panels that an LMFT can. So that, to me, seems like the most obvious reason for this particular change.
and I have reached out to representatives from the Kansas Department for Aging Disability Services, as well as the Kansas Department of Health and Environment, because they're both heavily involved in terms of reimbursements. And that's really something that's mostly outside of the scope of our agency. But given all the different types of licenses that would go into effect based on if this bill does pass, I wanted them to be aware of that. And I also wanted them to be aware of the issue in terms of the creation of this new type of license where individuals will be using those titles and initials that are currently reserved to permanent license holders. Because I don't know what effect that could have. I know how it seems to look, and I know how it feels, but from a practical standpoint, from the individuals that really oversee those Medicaid and Medicare reimbursements, I wanted to make sure that there was nothing lost on their radar in terms of what is happening with this. And so I've looped them both in and made them aware of what language to look at and review, and made myself available if they have questions on some of that too.
David, can I ask, I don't see certified community behavioral health centers in here. They didn't mention CCBHCs, but all the CMHCs are transitioning to CCBHCs. So effectively, none of them, after they transition, would be able to even utilize this license.
And I'm not sure I could really answer that in terms of that distinction, but I don't think there is language, at least not from the last version that I saw, that talked about CCBHCs. It seemed like it was within the scope of employment of community mental health centers.
Yeah, and they're all being phased out like in the next 24 months. So that seems like an important oversight.
I will say, though, all the CMHCs are going to stay licensed as a CMHC still. They'll still have the CMHC license, but then the certification of a CCBHC. So maybe that's how that would be covered. So David, you had said that they could carry this for as long, they could carry this for up to 24 months, right? Is that what you said?
So in the bill, one of the changes would be that the temporary licenses would all move to a standard of 24 months. And so this new community-based license essentially used that same language. Almost all of the language that describes these community-based licenses mirrors the temporary licenses, except that they would have to be under the scope of employment at one of those 4 types of providers, and also under the supervision of someone with a clinical license.
I guess I'm still trying to understand why this would be different than a temporary license then. I know you've said it. I'm sorry. I'm just trying to, kind of like other people, wrap my head around.
Sure. Well, and I've kind of been,
for that instead of a T then is what I'm wondering too.
Yeah, so I think I've been a little bit in the weeds on some of these things because I've spent a lot of time over at the Capitol and talking to different individuals on it. I think one of the main differences is that we have specific language in statute right now to really make sure that individuals know if they're receiving services with someone with a temporary license. And so there's language in the statute that basically says if you have someone with a temporary license, they can use LMFT with a dash that says temporary, or they can say that they have a licensed mental health, licensed marriage and family therapist license of a temporary nature. So they have to really designate that it's a temporary license. It's not a permanent license. One of the main things about these new community-based licenses is that they wouldn't have to have any kind of designation that it was a temporary license. So they would be able to basically just say, I can use the term licensed marriage and family therapist without saying that it's a temporary license, even though it is limited to 24 months. And I can use those initials at the end of my name within the context of my employment there, but I don't have to say that it's a temporary LMFT. And so I think that's one of the major concerns from some of the professions.
But it's only within certain settings that they would be eligible to do this.
Yeah, they would have to be within the scope of employment at those places.
Okay. So it's not somebody that would be just practicing in private practice with maybe a supervisor that could do that. They'd have to be in those particular settings. Okay.
And there's not a lot of detail to this. This was not something that was brought to the board early last year. The board really had a chance to kind of, bring to the advisory committees and work through. And in my conversations with some of the advocates for this, it doesn't appear that it was modeled after anything in another state. So there was really nothing for us to really research on this, except to look to see what was a specific language that was added and how does it compare to what we have now. And it looks like it's basically a temporary license by a different name with a different type of supervision and also within the scope of employment at some of those places.
And longer,
Well, so
2 years rather than 1 year.
so the language in the bill changes those regular temporary licenses from 1 year to 2 year. And so it makes it consistent with that change that would be in the bill for the normal temporary licenses.
Oh, so the TLMFT will be 2 years as well.
That's correct. Yep. Yeah, because right now, I think some of the temporary licenses, like let's say for the licensed psychology profession, those temporary licenses last for 2 years, but most of the other temporary licenses lasted for 1 year. And we had heard from some individuals that they were struggling to pass the licensure examination. And so they would get a temporary license, take the test maybe once or twice during that time frame and not be able to pass it. And so then they would need to have essentially what would happen is their temporary license would expire. They wouldn't be able to work any further and they could reapply to take the test again, but you can't get that temporary license again. And so this gives them a little bit more time to work under the temporary license and take the licensing examination. Hopefully they pass the first time and it's not even an issue that you wouldn't need the 24 months. But if something did come up, it does give them a little more flexibility with that.
So would the rules with this one be similar to the temporary license as well? So if I'm remembering right, you can't start your supervision plan under a temporary license to count those hours until you have your full. I'm remembering this wrong. Okay, I'm seeing some shaking of the heads. So maybe not, never mind. I just didn't know if a supervision plan can start under this community-based license where they can start counting their hours under appropriate clinical supervision. I, for some reason, thought you couldn't do that under the T, but I must be wrong with that.
You can start accruing hours if you have an approved training plan. But with the community-based license, I don't think there was anything added specifically for this in terms of that. So there's, this piece was just added right in the middle of statutes without really being worked through and figuring out how it would apply. So there's probably going to be a number of those types of questions that it's not going to fit very well with the existing wording and the framework. And so probably one of those things we'll have to kind of wrestle with to figure out, how this would work exactly.
I can see how it could benefit, and I mean, I work for one of these agencies, but how it could benefit some of those agencies as they're trying to recruit people and build up their workforce to have the ability to do this. That's where I can see how that could be, I guess, helpful in those settings. Because I think what you said, Mary Jones, is right. I mean, the reimbursement piece is what is often a challenge with those temporary licensed people, and yeah, which can be challenging.
And I think from the board's main role is protection of the public, and for our licensed professions, it's been sort of our standard, to very much be protective of the labels and the titles that are used and the disclosure of credentials. And so I think the bigger board concern is the public protection of people understanding who they are receiving services from and what level they actually are licensed to practice, and there would be no distinguishing in this case.
Yeah, and I also wanted to mention too, that in terms of the workforce, the board is very aware there is a need for more individuals providing services. But I want to share something with you, and this is information that we share with the board every board meeting. But I think it could be helpful because I sometimes come to some of the committee meetings of the legislature, and there's narratives that are pushed forward, and I feel like sometimes I have to combat some of the narratives. What I'm showing you here is a history of permanent licenses under the board. And I've done a little bit of research going back to July of 2015 through the current. And so I know it's a lot of numbers, but this basically shows each of the levels of permanent license that we have. And back in July of 2015, there were about 12,152 permanent licenses under the board. As of March 2023, which is the last time that we ran the full report, that number had climbed to about 14,847. And on page 2, I'll just show you the marriage and family therapy license. So when you group both the two levels of license back in July of 2015, there were about 798 permanent licenses. And currently now there's about 300 more than there were just about 8 years ago. And so overall, the total number of licensees under the board has grown by almost 3,000 in that time period. And the number of marriage and family therapists has grown by about 300 over that time period. So I think sometimes there is sort of a narrative that is being pushed that maybe the BSRB, we're not licensing people, or we're just not having people, enter these professions. And I think that's a narrative we need to push back on a little bit more, because it's not true. The board is having a lot of good conversations about looking at the current license requirements and looking to see, are there things that other states are doing that are creative and more ways to look at getting people into the pipeline. But the idea that, it's the end of the world and the sky is falling and there's no licensees, it's just not true. There are licensees. I think one thing that we've seen, though, is there has been an increase in demand for services, and people need services. And the board is very aware of that. I know all of you are too. And that's why we're meeting and we're having these conversations, and we're bringing forward bills, and we're looking at regulatory changes. But the idea that we're not licensing people, or that we are this major hindrance to practitioners, I think is a false premise. So I just wanted to show those numbers to you, so you would actually see how many people are entering these professions and how many licensees and the growth in these professions, which is really good. And there is still more work to be done, but I want you to kind of see these numbers, because I know there are individuals out there that are bringing a different story to the table. And I just want you to see the numbers and kind of make sure to have information on that topic too.
Okay, so along that score, back now to the legislation about your needing to do things expeditiously. So you have more licensees to manage and no increase in staff. It sounds like you're the only regulatory board that has to be concerned about this, if I heard you right, which also is intriguing to me, but I'll let that lie. If you fail to meet these criteria, what happens? I assume then the downside to that is that opens up liability concerns, complaints regarding the regulatory board that a person could have, or what's I guess what I'm saying is I don't know if it's coming across this way. I mean this empathetically. If you're unable to meet a standard by having more demand with higher pressure with the same amount or less staff, and you're unable to meet that standard, what happens?
Yeah, so we added a part-time staff member last year, and that was approved by the legislature when they passed. That was due to them passing the bill that called for expedited licensure of military members and the new timeframes for reciprocity. But you're right, we have had a number of licensees enter the profession. We do see growth. And so I believe that in order to meet these standards, we would need additional staffing. And I think starting with 2 would be the first step. And figuring out the logistics, but it's very likely we would need to approach the legislature and ask for more. Because initially, based on trying to meet these timeframes, my initial thought process was we would probably need about 4.5, and that would involve some clerical employees and also licensing specialists. And I'd be willing to start with 2, but the legislature is also looking at not wanting to grow government and not wanting to appear that we're having an increase in these agencies. But if they're adding more requirements, there's no other way for us to meet these new timeframes and do this additional work and without the staffing to do that. So in terms of your question, though, it would add this in law as basically a requirement for the BSRB, but there is nothing that was added in terms of what the penalty would be if we, fail to meet that standard. So I don't know that I could really comment on that, but I can tell you that we're being mindful of looking to see what our requirements in law are, and we're trying to make sure that we don't fail to meet the requirements in law. But in terms of an exact penalty, that wasn't part of the new language that was added. In terms of us being the only agency, it is a little troubling to me, and that was one of the items of concern that I did raise to the members of the legislature. They asked health agencies to come forward, and the BSRB came forward with a big bill to address a lot of concerns. And in response, one of their responses was, okay, well, we're also going to give you this gold standard review timeframe. And there were a lot of other agencies that could have come forward with possible solutions too. And maybe if they would have offered bills, maybe they also would have been put under this as well. I don't know. I know that the board worked really hard and we came to the table with a big bill, and the response from the legislature was this. And so I think it's particularly troubling because I would like, and I know the board is supportive of this too, we'd like to work with the legislature and really be good partners in this process. But it really does feel like in response to trying to be helpful, we're being squeezed in a way that's going to make it very difficult for us to, continue to provide customer service to people and make sure that we're getting things done in a timely manner. And one of those items I talked about in terms of doing the expedited licensure, if you pay an extra fee, you can jump to the front of the line. The domino effect of that is if we have people who do that, even if they are able to get licensed, it has the cascading effect of everyone else being pushed back by somebody else jumping to the front. And so things are problematic for sure.
I just wanted to clarify the decreasing the diagnosis hours from 6 to 3. Was that included in the in Senate Bill 131?
It was included in Senate Bill 131 to decrease it from 6 down to 3. Now, the corresponding piece, the board has been supportive of adding that new 3-hour requirement in cultural diversity. That part is not included. So they went ahead and decreased it from 6 to 3, but didn't have the other corresponding piece in the cultural diversity. And I believe, I need to go back and check this, but I believe that decrease would probably start on January 1st of 2025. So it probably wouldn't affect the individuals that are currently coming upon renewal. It would be for individuals in the future.
And I think, certainly, while we're not the social work profession, there's a lot of concern around public safety and education requirements around the clinical work and the way this wording has played out in that portion of the bill. And it's just very interesting to see the types of things that can get added, changed, edited. But from the board standpoint, again, in terms of ensuring that the public is safe and there's public trust in professionals and their ability to provide therapeutic clinical services, it's definitely an interesting change of language.
And do I understand correctly that at present, unlike our profession, social workers do not need a board approved supervisor?
Correct.
Yes.
That was stricken. The legislators took that out of the bill as well. The advisory committee had proposed that piece, and that now I think 2 years in a row has been taken out. Is that correct, David? So I think it was put in 2 years ago as a suggestion.
Yeah, 2 years ago, it was one of the items that was initially in the board's bill, and then it was removed. And then this year it was brought back, and then it was removed again.
Whether it's true or not, it feels to me like the standards for social workers continue to go down while ours go up. or remain steady. Is that, am I being too bold in making that statement?
I don't think that's a bold statement. I think the Kansas social work group have a very strong advocacy voice and presence, and
Yes, for sure.
assert that. And I think that's an accurate description. I think it's a fair description.
Yeah, and I can tell you too, these hearings are challenging because they try to give everyone the same amount of time. And when the bill was being heard by the House committee, there were a few individuals, it appeared that they were coordinated because they were all saying similar things, but they were coming to the House committee basically asking for removal of a requirement in licensure. That's not actually a requirement for the social work profession. They were all of the same impression that for clinical social workers seeking reciprocity, that they all have to have additional years of practice beyond what would normally be required if they're at a clinical level. And that's not a requirement. That's actually something that we have as one of the possible ways that they can meet the reciprocity requirements. And so it's there as a way to do it as a flexibility in terms of they have to meet 2 of those 3 requirements, but we're not requiring it for everyone. But multiple people came to the podium and said, this is making it very challenging. We need this to be removed. And then, Leslie Allen and I both came to the podium and said, there appears to be some misunderstanding, their confusion. This is not a requirement. It is one of the 2 of the 3 possible options, but we're not requiring this from everyone seeking reciprocity. And then when it was clarified, they kind of backed down from there. But it appears that certain individuals, when we bring items to the table and from the legislature, they see that as an opportunity to come forward and say, okay, well, what else can we remove from the statutes? And that's really troubling because I understand that there are different camps, and some people say, there's all these barriers to licensure. And from our perspective, we're really trying to make sure what's reasonable and what's a good standard to make sure we keep the public safe. But we have different priorities and different goals in certain cases. And so, but I think, yeah, I agree with Mary. Your comments are accurate in that. And that's something we've seen in the last few bills. There was a bill that passed a couple of years ago in which individuals from the social work profession advocated to have certain things removed from statute. And one of the things that it inadvertently did was it removed some of the flexibility for us to evaluate applicants who received a practicum that was a non-clinical practicum. And so for that time period, individuals who applied who didn't have a clinical practicum were not going to meet the standards for licensure. And so we had to do a cleanup bill the following year to go back in there and fix some of the statutes that were modified from those social work advocacy groups who wanted a lot of things removed. And one of the items that they asked for removal had an inadvertent consequence of really hurting people who were applying for licensure as social workers. So that's one of the reasons why I made it a point to really schedule meetings with members of committees outside to really give them the opportunity to ask questions and really be informed on these issues. Because when the bill was worked by the Senate, when there was in the Senate committee, I had 2 minutes total to talk to members of the Senate committee. And I had just as much time as anybody else who wanted to come before the Senate committee to talk in favor or against the bill or make any request for something to be modified. And so it's a really challenging process, but I did everything I could think of and met with everyone that I could in terms of making sure they had a good understanding of the problems.
Well, I do want to thank you for your efforts.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. I think, was there anything more on that you?
Just nothing more on that. Just wanted to make 2 little comments, or actually there's one. In terms of another legislative update, there was a bill 2288 that did pass the legislature and went to the governor and has been signed into law. That would add Kansas to a professional counselor multi-state compact, and that's for the clinical level of professional counselors. And so that counseling compact does have enough members for their commission to be meeting. They started meeting for the first time last fall. That's not one that has actually been launched. And so they're not issuing privileges to practice in different states yet, but Kansas will become a member of that professional counseling compact on July 1st. And in the meanwhile, we'll be looking at our role as a state as part of that compact moving forward. So with that, I have nothing further into my report.
And I'm certainly not hearing anything yet on the type of interstate compact for MFT practitioners. But now this is our second interstate compact. So I'm thinking this is a more to come situation for us.
Yeah, and the language for the social work multi-state compact was worked on last year. They finalized that language, I believe, towards the end of February. So I would expect that it may be offered in Kansas sometime next year in terms of legislative session.
Okay, any other questions or comments for Dave? Thanks for that. I know it's a lot of information, but it is important as advisory committee members to just sort of see and hear the work, the work that we did last year to carry forward and to do some meaningful things. The board approved our suggestions and moved forward in a lot of those things, but there's just things that, as we see, we have no control over at some point and may still impact our agency. Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to old business. There was a discussion item on care for clients who are in crisis after hours as one of our old discussion items. So this particular item, if you recall, was referred back to advisory committees to give some suggestions or opinions, and whether or not that, saying for someone to call 988 is a sufficient response for a practitioner to take care of their after hours clients. So I don't know if we want to open up discussion on that, or David, if there's other pieces I should round out for that talking point conversation from your perspective.
Yeah, I think you summarized that well. Some of the other advisory committees have, if they believe that there should be something, specific to make sure that the public is more aware of, or licensees are more aware of. Some of them have looked at their unprofessional conduct regulations to see if some of the language can be modified to address a concern like this. For your profession, I looked through some of those unprofessional conduct regulations. And I guess the item that potentially could come into play on this would be, this is the unprofessional conduct regulations for your profession, but item number 39, failing to seek continuation of service or abandoning or neglecting a client under or in need of professional care without making reasonable arrangements for that care. So that as a potential starting point, you could use as the base if you have any recommendations on this point. But part of it was having a discussion about, is it sufficient to have a plan where you just let individuals know that if they're in a time of crisis after hours, then they can call 911 or call 988, or does there need to be something more that those clients are aware of? And then do we need to look at identifying a responsibility of practitioners, including what they need to provide to clients, perhaps in terms of some of those services that are available?
I can jump in. I wasn't at the last meeting, but from the local perspective, a lot of our private practitioners specifically encourage their clients to utilize the CMHC system, which is really challenging on the CMHC system in terms of coordination of care. So we don't have any mechanisms in place for notifying private practitioners when their clients are in crisis and are being screened or assessed by us. If the individual can't provide us that information. I mean, there's just so many logistical things that happen that really don't promote us interfacing very well. I think probably our crisis director would say she would love it if private practitioners would manage their after hours crisis situations on their own. But yeah, I don't know what the solution is in terms of how to better collaborate. I mean, we have a system that is open to anyone who needs it in terms of after hours assessments and things like that, as well as emergency room assessments. But right now it is a cluster, to say the least.
Yeah, I think, Jardine, that's a really thoughtful conversation. And I think that's what sort of prompted this to come back up to the table. My understanding is several years ago, under another executive director, there was an opinion given that suggested that perhaps as a private practitioner or even other practitioners would need to have a formal arrangement with a crisis center or after hours to be the only referral source, and really it was up to the practitioner to care for emergency situations from their clients. And so but nothing was done formally about that. And so the question before us is, do we feel like our practitioners, that this should fall under professional conduct, is a plan for treating your client crisis after hours? That doesn't preclude them or eliminate the fact that someone can call 988 or the crisis hotline and get services, because that is a community resource, right? But is just saying call 988 a sufficient plan? You know, I think there's opinions either way for sure on that one.
Yeah, if I can jump in. So I've actually visited with several people in private practice about this, and just to get some thoughts. And there was a theme that ran through that, especially those who are in a solo practice or only with one or two, that they would not see high risk clients if that was the case, if they were expected. One's a single mom, and she said it would just be impossible for me to provide, services to them at midnight or 2 a.m. So I think the language of that is important. Is the 988 having that, going through a safety plan, having the 988 available. And I appreciate being local with Jardine, the ability to use the Crisis Stabilization Center of Pawnee, but there often isn't that coordination. So we might have clients from our university clinic who have gone over the weekend, but we're not even aware that they went to that. So yes, it's a challenge, but I think we also have to recognize that it could potentially put a burden on private practitioners where they don't accept high risk clients or don't work with them.
I appreciate that opinion, Marcy. I think what's so hard though too is you don't always know when somebody's going to move from a non-high risk to a high risk, because things can change really quickly. I do wonder, and I don't even know how this would take place, but kind of like, how do we increase the ability to collaborate and coordinate? And so we've got a lot of private practice clinicians in our town, and I've always encouraged them, like, if you want to make us a part of your crisis plan, that's fine. But could you have like a release sign that's like in the event of a crisis? And if you do have a plan in place with somebody and you've used us as that plan, like Call Horizons, could we be aware of what some of the plan is? And that would need to be done through a release. Like you need to follow the right steps, but so that if they were to contact us, we would have an idea of, oh, okay, so they're working on this, or they have this diagnosis, or that we can just know what some of the plan is so that we can care for that individual well. Because I get what you're saying, Marcy, is it would be hard, especially when you're practicing solo, like to be on call 24/7. I mean, that's not realistic. And but yeah, how do you collaborate then with who is the plan, like who is the person or the group that can assist in those moments? That's what I've encouraged some of our private practices to do. Just, if you're going to use us as the plan, can you let us know? And can you request, see if that client would sign a release that we could coordinate in the event of a crisis, and do follow-up care pretty well too.
Well, I think part of the other part of the plan is, like in Wichita, you've got CommCare, mental health associates, but if you're looking at someone who potentially needs hospitalization or things like that, we usually have to go through those agencies to kind of help with that process, because they're the door. But if I have a client that's in my office that's, say, I know it's a high risk, I've done PHQ, or I'm just concerned about his history or whatever, I certainly would try to work out with the family what's the plan, if there's family involvement, but if I'm looking at hospitalization, I'm going to have to go to St. Joe, or I'm going to have to go get there. I don't know who the people are. They've got lots of changeover, and sometimes that happens. I tried to, we have a group practice in my private practice part, and we do rotate the on-call, but it's still going to be, we need you to go to St. Joe to get screened, or if you're having a psychotic breakdown and you need meds, most of the private practitioners don't prescribe meds, and so they're going to need to have access to psychiatric and those things too. So that's part of the other aspect of going to those CVHCs, or whatever their abbreviations are. But that's in a private practice, that's kind of, you're limited by what you have access to. That's my thoughts.
Yeah, so, oh, thanks. Go ahead, Jim.
I just gonna say, I'd just like to catch on to what John's saying as far as with lack of resources, especially in Western Kansas, as far as trying to find, anything beyond maybe a hospital, if there is even a hospital around. And then, also the access of, the private practice person is going to be, they're probably going to know the number anyway. And then they're going to, if they're in a crisis, they're going to call somebody that, most likely they've been dealing with. And that's going to be either a physician, emergency room, or maybe, even, somebody that they know that may have some access to some knowledge of where to go. And I think that's part of it, is that, a lot of the private practice people don't, know where else to send them. Oh,
Well, if I'm hearing the conversation correctly, what I'm hearing is not a strong support for including specific language in our standards of professional conduct that say your obligation as a clinician is to care for after hours emergencies, or to have a formal arrangement or a formal plan. Is that what I'm hearing sort of our committee settling on, or do we want to have further discussion on this? I'm sort of hearing a we're not really on board with moving forward with some specific language around this.
I think that would be premature to create some specific language without adequate resources. We also have to consider therapist safety too. Is a therapist being called into a situation that would be dangerous for the therapist, or if, as John mentioned, somebody who's having a psychotic break, that may be a 911 call. And so I guess that I think it would be premature to have specific language about that.
Yeah, and I think clarification, this didn't come up as a not being able to use the community resources. We all know, particularly if you have Medicaid clients, you're going to have to funnel through the CMHC to get screening and all of those kind of things. And certainly in emergency, anyone can show up in an emergency department. The real sort of crux of this is, as a clinician, is it my obligation to say, if you are having suicidal thoughts, here's my after hours phone number, or here's who takes my rotation of call, or those kind of things as a first line of defense. Again, not excluding community resources, obviously 911, 988, community crisis centers, but as sort of an additional step in there, your obligation to your clients when you take on a client caseload. So sounds to me like the opportunity. Marcy, I appreciate the fact that you sort of spoke with a few people and got some opinions. And, maybe that's also a good step is to just continue to bring this back up as a dialogue. We'll hear in the board meeting what maybe some of the other advisory committees are coming to with this particular issue, and we'll bring that back to you all as well. So I think that's always nice to share the opinions of sort of how other groups are attacking this particular issue. Okay, thank you. The next item is an update on the clinical supervision training manual. It was attached in your materials, so I don't know which member would like to just sort of provide us an overview of where this is. I haven't read through it, but it certainly looks great. So thank you so far for all of this work.
Well, and I can start the conversation, and
Okay.
then if any of the members that were served on that subcommittee want to add some additional comments, that would be great.
However, before we get started, I'm sorry, I'm in a hotel and my hotel checkout is now.
Okay.
They've been knocking at the door, and so I'm gonna have to leave because I'm in Manhattan, so I'm trying to drive.
Okay.
So,
Okay, thanks, John. Please pay attention to the date of the next meeting because we're going to try to move it a week. So we'll make sure to get
Okay.
those materials out to you.
okay,
Thank you.
thanks.
So last fall, the Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee requested a subcommittee be formed for the purpose of putting together a clinical supervision manual. And one of the items that it was somewhat modeled after was a similar manual that existed for the social work profession. And certain members of the advisory committee volunteered to serve on the subcommittee, and that was Jardine, Nicole, and Marcy. And so I really appreciate their work on that. The subcommittee did meet twice, and Leslie Allen, the assistant director and licensing manager, and also Joan Hahn and myself, we helped out with the subcommittee as well. And what you have in your material is essentially a manual with some helpful information for clinical supervisors. And so, and I apologize that this had not been brought forward before today, because the members of the subcommittee did a lot of good work on this last fall, and it was we're at a good stopping point back at the beginning of December. I believe around that time period, I think one of the complications was that the Secretary of State changed how they had posted some of the regulations. And so I believe previously they had PDFs of certain regulations, and then they made a change on their website to have those directly posted, so that way it would always update as long as you post that. So kind of a technical thing, but behind the scenes, we reworked all of the links to the KAR's administrative regulations. And so all of those link to the Secretary of State's website in terms of some of the definitions, some of the information about applications and fees and unprofessional conduct. And then the statutes, those link to the Revisor of Statutes office. There's also some links in this document that have to do with certain forms that would be used or other FAQ material on the BSRB website. But that is sort of from a high level, some of the different items that are included in this. And I'll go ahead and defer to the members of the subcommittee if they want to add any comments about some of the discussions maybe that took place. I know it was several months ago now, but this is kind of a cleaned up version of the document, and it has now been posted on the BSRB website under the Marriage and Family Therapy professions page on the BSRB website. But if any members of the subcommittee have some additional comments, feel free to go ahead and voice them for the advisory committee.
Honestly, David, it was so long ago. This was like, oh yeah, I forgot we did this. Yeah. It looks really great. I like how it turned out. I think some of the things that we wanted in here were having like links to the frequently asked questions, and then just helping people get directly to different documents, because some of the documents are just hard to find when you're on the website looking for which statutes or things apply to what exactly you're looking for. And so this hopefully will make it simpler for people to find what they need and to get the questions answered before they have to get on the phone to try to contact someone directly. So yeah, I appreciate the staff time that went into putting this together. That made our job a lot easier to just make recommendations. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I just echo everything that you just said, Jardine. And it's been a while, but yeah, I thought it was a really good conversation. And yeah, I just echo everything that you said.
Well, I appreciate the work that you all did on this, and really, I think this is a great document, and I think it'll be helpful for individuals. One thing that's nice is when, I know how much work you all do as members of the advisory committee, and I appreciate your conversations here. Every once in a while, it's nice to have a nice tangible thing that you can hold to say, we did this, and I think it'll be helpful for a lot of people too. So appreciate everything that you guys did as part of the subcommittee for this document as well. So.
And is that, you said that's available on the website now so that we can disseminate that?
Yes, and so feel free to forward the copy that you received in your materials, but also on the BSRB website. If you click on the professions page for marriage and family therapy, it's the second link. And so this document is now published there. So feel free to use that. It should just pull up the PDF of this document so you can forward that or just direct people to that page, because that page has some other FAQ information as well.
Is there a mechanism by which we could send it to board approved supervisors?
I think we could do that. Yeah.
I mean, I think that would be great. It's a great launching, a great way to launch it. And again, acknowledgement of the subcommittee's work on this, but I think that is a great way to get it in front of board approved supervisors to say, we've created this tool and it's available.
Yeah, I echo that, Mary Jones. I was just thinking about when I got my training last year that we did have to dive a lot through things. And I think like Jennifer J was the one that trained me. And I think that would have been so helpful for her as a trainer too, to just talk through all of that very, yeah, just be able to flow through that easily. So I think that's a great idea.
Fantastic. Well, just thank you again to the subcommittee for the effort and the staff as well of the BSRB for putting that in place. I think it really, to me, is a real tangible accomplishment, but also a way to say how important this is for our supervisors and supervisees, that we have this direction to give them and a resource tool. So thank you for doing that. Okay, I'm going to move to the new business item. And the first one was changes to the clinical training plans in KAR 102757A. So that was attached in your packet as well. And I know David probably wants to step in here and talk about this, but this particular item is surrounding the requirement of trainees to submit their changes to the BSRB office within 45 days of training. And there's been some discussion of late cases actually that have come before the board for issues related to those who have not submitted their changes to the BSRB on their training plan, whether that be workplace items, job title items, address changes, maybe clientele changes. Just there's various issues that have come up, not a lot, but the ones that have come before the board have been quite substantial. And I think, most recently there was someone who didn't report a job change, and that was effectively 2 years of that licensee's training plan that had to be excluded because it wasn't reported to the board as an update of the training plan. So this discussion item will have a couple of different elements. And Dave has some, I think, some suggestions and feedbacks, and just sort of thinking about what's really important in updates in clinical training plans. So Dave, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Mary. And I thought you framed this discussion very, very well. This is the regulation. It's KAR 102-5-7A that deals with that professional postgraduate supervised experience required for individuals seeking to become a clinical marriage and family therapist. And the item in particular that we're discussing today is item H, which I've highlighted here. And the language of the regulation currently says all changes to the clinical supervision training plan shall be submitted by the supervisee to the board for its approval. The changes shall be submitted no more than 45 days after the date on which the changes took effect. If the supervisee fails to submit the changes to the board within that 45-day period, no supervised hours of practice shall be accrued or credited for any practice beginning on the date the changes took effect through the date on which the changes to the plan are approved by the board. And so, Mary, as you said, that does create some challenging scenarios in certain cases, because the board is sometimes put into a position of, if a change was not reported, does the person lose all of those hours? And based on this wording, if it really was a significant change, then they would lose those hours from the time period where they made that change until essentially when they submitted the change to the board. And so, but it's led to a discussion of really what constitutes a change. And part of this is to make sure that individuals who are accruing these hours really have a good understanding of things that would constitute changes. But also from our perspective as a licensing body, when people ask us questions, we want to make sure that we're giving them good information. And from the board's perspective, if they're enforcing these regulations, it would be helpful for them perhaps to have a little bit more detail they could point to and say, the regulation clearly states that these are the types of changes that you would have to notify the board. And so one thing we were having a discussion on is, can we help by adding some language to identify the potential changes that individuals should be aware of reporting? And so Joan Hahn is the member of my staff who does all of the clinical training plans. And I talked with her about possible items that she thought would be helpful, at least as a starting point of this conversation. And she put together sort of a list of possible changes to be considered that would be reported, which includes new or additional work site, changes in position at an approved work site, changes in duties or responsibilities at an approved work site, a new or additional supervisor, adding group supervision after the training plan is approved, or if the supervisee is no longer accruing hours towards a clinical licensure because they're either taking a break or just stopping. And this is not a comprehensive list. It was more of, I was asking her if we were going to identify these with specific language, what kind of things do you think would be helpful for the advisory committees to discuss? And then ultimately, this was a good conversation for us to have in the advisory committee. And then the goal is to forward back recommendations to the board, so that way the board can have a conversation on consistent standards. And then that way, each of these different regulations for the professions that have language like this, there could be consistent standards between the professions. And so this was the sort of the starting language. But then also that 45-day time period, that was another piece of it too. Is there something that we can do to address that? Because as Mary said, it doesn't really involve a lot of individuals who fall into this. Most of the individuals, when they make a change, they submit a change to their plan, and it's reviewed and it's approved. But for those ones who don't, and then it can have really severe consequences in terms of all the time they spent, and then also the cost element involved too. So trying to look for ways that we can be helpful, and then also make sure that everyone has a better understanding of the process too. So I guess at this point, I would say if there's any members of the advisory committee that have thoughts on this topic, or if you have any thoughts on potential changes that you think would be helpful for individuals to have even more notice of, to make sure that they report those.
Yeah, go ahead, Jardine, go ahead.
I was going to just say, I like this initial list. My thought is, I wonder is there any room for a process to appeal, to where if I, like for this example that Mary gave, where I didn't report my change and now I'm applying and I'm realizing that I didn't report a change and so my hours don't count. Is there any room for a mechanism to appeal that, so that individuals can have some sort of attestation from someone that would allow them to have their whatever that change was revisited and legitimized by someone who could say that they did in fact meet the requirements, and this change happened on this date, blah blah blah, something like that. I can imagine that person's devastated.
Yeah, as a quick response to that, there is a mechanism for an appeal. That does exist. What is more difficult in the mechanism that when they when they appeal and that goes to hearing, is that really the hearing has to be, the judgment of the board has to be really within the confines of what's in regulatory or statutory language. So, at the end of the day, if the language says this, so I hear what you're saying. So I think that's a great note to consider or think about.
Well, and we've talked a little bit internally here at the office about why the 45-day requirement exists. And I think, the main thing is we don't want people to waste time accruing hours that are not going to count. And so really the 45-day requirement is more or less, it's supposed to be a protection for people to make sure that they report those things, because we don't want people to be doing hours and spending a lot of time or money trying to accrue hours towards a clinical license that wouldn't qualify. And so this is something as a way to help individuals to make sure they know to report those changes to be reviewed. And in most cases, those changes are probably going to be approved. But if they're not, we want to make sure people actually submit those changes to us.
Mhm.
I apologize because I should know this answer and I don't. So if a trainee changes jobs, or let's say adds on, I'm thinking of our students, our PhD students, some of them add on a private work after they're licensed in addition to their clinical work, and they make a change to their training plan. Do they have to go through then all of those series of questions? Or is it more streamlined where they can just say, hey, I'm adding this
Yeah.
practice
There,
on?
there is a very simple form on the BSRB website for adding work sites, changing supervisors, adding supervisors. It's a very simple, you don't have to go through the questionnaire again.
Thank you.
Uh-huh. Yeah, and I can think of, again, just the change of position at an approved work site. People get promotions, job changes, but fundamentally the clinical work stays the same. And so that's one to me where I have question marks around that. How important is the job title if the fundamental aspects of the role still maintains the content of the clinical plan? So that's sort of one of those question areas for me, but I think this is a good starting list.
Mary Jo, that was exactly
Yes.
my thought. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, that was exactly what I was thinking about, was those job changes that happen at it's already an approved site. And for the most part, your job is not changing that much. You're still doing a lot of the same clinical work. And so that was one of my question areas as well. So if that could, I don't know if it's clarified or if it's more of saying like, I don't know. Yeah, I don't really have a good way to word that, but that was my question as well. So, yeah.
What I would suggest, just in the interest of time, because I do want to touch on a few of the other pieces just as work items till our next meeting, that we consider to think about this list and this discussion item to bring back to the next advisory meeting, because I think it's a good discussion to have, and there could be some suggestions and proposals about the types of things we want to say you have to report. But this sort of gets the topic in front of you to think about, and we can continue to refine that list a little bit. But I appreciate Joan thinking that for us and putting through the things that she sees most often. Any other comments on that topic before I move on? Because we have the discussion B, which are the continuing education, the KR 102.510, and then the 102.511 documentation for continuing education. This is also an item where I think we can introduce the topic to you today and then ask you to review and be thinking about it for our next meeting. Dave, do you want to take that piece?
Yeah, just briefly. So part of the reason we wanted to revisit these particular regulations, so the legislature has passed a bill last year that requires all agencies to be on a schedule in terms of providing a report back to the legislature. And for the BSRB, our report is due in 2026. But essentially, we have to provide a very big report that would indicate for each of our regulations whether it is necessary for the implementation of state law, or if not, we would have to go through steps to repeal some of that. And there's also been comments made by the legislature in the last few years about agencies not doing timely reviews of their regulations or updating things when they need to be updated. And so for that first regulation, KAR 102-5-10, that's continuing education for licensees, it notes how many hours are required for your profession. It also notes what types of activities would be things that would constitute or be counted as continuing education for your profession. It also includes some language about a few different activities that would not be included as continuing education for your profession. And this was last modified 20 years ago, back in 2003. So it's definitely a good idea to go through this, review the language, see if it's still consistent, or if there's new items that you think would be helpful to be added here. Just for context, I've talked to some other states about what they allow for continuing education. Some states open up continuing education a bit more. These are really focused on education for the actual profession, but in some states, they count a certain number of hours for things that I would think of a little bit more like community service. For example, one state that I heard about, they allow a certain number of hours during a license period for licensees that volunteer their time during elections, staffing a poll. And so I'm not saying that I recommend that, or that I've taken any position on that as a change to the continuing education requirements. But in terms of context from what other states, I've heard about that. I've also heard that there are some states that allow more broad trainings that would be helpful more as a process than specific to the profession. For example, perhaps training in something like studying the law or studying language, that those skills could be applied to your professional career. Something to think about in terms of, do you think there should be any changes to these regulations or not? But definitely given the time period and how long ago it was, these were last modified, this would be a good one to review. The accompanying regulation 102-5-11 is documentation for continuing education. And that regulation really indicates what different items would be sufficient to show or demonstrate that you had really attained those hours of continuing education. This was last updated back in 1997. And so if you think about the changes in technology during that time period and how the internet and other different things like that have changed, this is probably good for something to review to see if there should be additional language added here. And then from a practical standpoint, 10% of all licensees are audited upon renewal, and they have to demonstrate or show proof of completing those continuing education. And so for individuals, sometimes they come down to trying to figure out what they actually need to send to the board office to show that they completed their hours. And we don't want them to have to bear the cost of sending hundreds and hundreds of pages of things if they're not needed. And from our perspective, we don't really want to hold all that paper here at the office either. And so if there's things that can be adjusted here, that would be to the benefit of the licensees and also to the licensing board. And then also making sure we're doing timely review of these regulations, that would be good too. So if you could review 102-5-10 and 102-5-11, and then as sort of a homework item, come back with recommended changes to these next meeting, that would be really helpful for us. And in the meanwhile, I'll do some looking as well, and I'll try to come back with any comments from the other advisory committees in terms of maybe some of the suggestions or concepts they had as well.
Great, thank you for that, David. We'll move on to that last item and discussion of adding new members to the advisory committee. As you all are aware, we added new members last go around. We do not currently, our committee doesn't have, at least in this year, members who will be terming off the advisory committee. Because of that, I think it might be a good opportunity for us to look at adding a few members to the advisory committee this year in that staggered approach. David, I didn't know if you wanted to go through like terms specifically, so I want to allow you space to do that if you'd like to do that. But I think it would be a good discussion to talk about. This might be a very good year to add on a couple of more members.
Sure. Yeah, and Mary, you're right. So advisory committee members, they serve 2-year terms, and you can serve up to 4 2-year terms. And so in my time with the BSRB, we've tried to go ahead and reach out to individuals who are coming upon the end of a 2-year term. They would need to be reappointed by the chair of the board. But for your advisory committee, you don't have any members coming up for reappointment this year, but next year, Jardine, John, and James are all coming at the end of their 4th term on the board. And so the advisory committee policy does state that in terms of non-board members that serve on the advisory committee, there should be a minimum of 3 individuals and a maximum of 10. And so given the factor of wanting to stagger some of those terms, I think it would probably be a good idea. And in terms of the process, one thing that we could do is we could send something out to licensees, let them know sort of what the role of the advisory committee is, some of the criteria that the advisory committee would be looking at in terms of evaluating recommended new members. And then I could collect those and then bring back information, letters of interest, resumes, and CVs from interested individuals, and then forward those to you. And then you could have a discussion on recommendations at the next meeting.
Thoughts, comments? We'd like to proceed that way.
Sounds good to me. I'd also be up for a discussion on recommending that we get rid of term limits.
I think Rebecca Culver would have said that last year, Jardine. Yeah. Joyce
like
too.
the
I
idea
think
of,
they
like,
both enjoyed their time on here.
Yeah, it would be nice to have like a mandatory break. Like you have to have like the off for so many years, but you could serve again in the future. It would just be nice to consider.
That does raise a question. Is it 4 consecutive terms?
I don't think
Dave
so.
has yours. You're a special case, Chris.
Yeah, it was usually be interpreted as 4 terms.
But Jardine, to your point, I mean, that could be an item that's brought forth as a recommendation. And so in a lot of committees and boards, you can term off for a year or 2 years and then come back and be eligible. So that to me, that's something we could consider to propose.
I definitely would like to in a future meeting. I think it's worth discussing.
So at this point, we are interested, David, in you moving forward and sending a request to licensees for interest in this. I think that it's a good time to do that.
Okay, I'll take care of that.
Thank you.
Thanks for remembering that, Mary. We talked about
Yes.
that.
Well,
Here.
yes, I know, but to be honest with you, David Fye helps me remember a lot of things. So thanks, you,
David.
for that. I'll put some credit where the credit is due. Thank you, though. The next meeting schedule, I wanted to just kind of run through some dates with you all. The next meeting would be scheduled for June, and we're typically on this period of Fridays. That in June, that falls when I'm out for a national conference, and so I'm suggesting June 16th. There was not a conflict from BSRB for that date. I wanted to check with the committee and see if that date seems to work with everyone.
I'm available.
I won't be available, but that's okay.
I'm a maybe.
You're a maybe. Is having a maybe and a not available is not good. Is there another date that we should look at? The June 2nd, there was already a conflict with another meeting being held. So that didn't work for the BSRB office.
I have
certainly
the rest of the Fridays available. The 23rd and the 30th are also open.
Same.
No, 23rd or 30th work.
Those are currently open for our calendar as well.
23rd works best for me if possible.
Okay, sounds like June 23rd would be a great date for the next meeting. And I know sometimes the August dates get hard for those who are in educational settings in MFT programs, but preliminarily, does that August date look good? August 11th?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great.
So I moved on my calendar the 9th to the 23rd. Will we still have the same Zoom link and so on?
Yeah, I'll adjust the calendar appointment so you'll still have the same information, and we'll update the public notice too. But we'll just move that from what was that? It was probably set for the 9th originally, so we'll move that so it'll be on Friday, June 23rd. So you shouldn't have to do anything except accept the new calendar appointment.
Thank you so much. Okay, just as sort of a reminder and follow-up, we will have some after-hours crisis discussion at the next meeting. Also, the continuing education and the training plan suggested amendments, and that any ideas around helping people with that 45-day reminder. So we have some we do have some homework between now and next time. Any other items from the advisory committee members? Okay, hearing none. Thank you so much for your time today. I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank
Second.
you. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.